The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The replacement bus was nowhere to be seen, and the cold began to creep in. Christabel wrapped her arms around her sisters, trying to keep them warm. Then, in the distance, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. The children perked up, hope flickering in their eyes. But as the sound grew louder, it wasn't the familiar purr of a school bus engine. It was a deep guttural roar, accompanied by the heavy clinking of chains. The driver's face turned ashen as a tanker truck appeared around the bend, its headlight blazing. It was moving too fast, its trailer swaying dangerously as it approached the stranded bus. "Everyone hold on," the driver shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The wall seemed to collapse around Janelle as the bus screamed off the road, crashing violently into the tanker. The deafening noise of the impact ran in her ears. For a moment, everything was dark. She was thrown from her seat, her body slamming against the side of the bus, and it tilted and overturned. There was a sudden explosion of heat, and then the smell of smoke and burning rubber filled the air. Janelle's heart raced as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. She was dizzy, struggling to breathe, as the air inside the bus became thick with smoke. The sound of screaming children and the cracking of fire were overwhelming. Panic erupted around her, but Janelle could barely process it. She felt the bus shift again, this time tilting further as it rolled to a stop. Her body was battered and she could feel blood on her skin, but she couldn't focus on the pain. All that mattered was survival, getting out of the bus, away from the flames. The fire was spreading quickly. It wasn't just the bus that was burning. The tanker had exploded, sending flames licking at the surrounding trees and the twisted metal of the wrecked bus. The sound of the fire was deafening. Janelle struggled to gather her bearing. She could hear her friends crying out for help, but the fire was too loud and the smoke too thick. She knew she had to move to find a way out before the flames closed in on her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Janet crawled over the wreckage, trying to get to the emergency exit. But it was blocked. The bus had flipped on its side and the way out was completely obstructed. Janet felt the heat press closer, the danger of the flames growing stronger by the second. She was dizzy and her breath was shallow. But somehow she managed to push herself to the front of the bus. There, just as she was starting to lose hope, she heard the sounds of people outside, shouts, sirens. The fire truck had arrived. The rescue team was there. She couldn't see them, but she could hear their voices cutting through the chaos. Janet tried to call out, but her voice was weak, barely audible above the roar of the fire. "Help, please, help," she cried out, but no one seemed to hear her. She called violently, trying to push herself further, but her vision was starting to blur and her strength was failing. On the outside of the bus, the scene was horrific. The crash has drawn an immediate response, but even the experienced emergency responders were horrified by what they saw. The bus was twisted, the fire was spreading fast, and there were children still trapped inside. They walked as quickly as possible, but the damage was immense. The tanker explosion had caused more destruction than anyone could have imagined. As firefighters battled the flames, paramedics rushed to the wreckage, pulling children from the debris. Their faces pale and their bodies covered in blood. Some were unconscious, others were crying in pain, while others lay still, unresponsive. In the chaos, they didn't see Janet at first. She was lost among the wreckage, her body pinned and covered in smoke. But when they finally spotted her, she was barely clinging to life. Her clothes were singed, and her skin was covered in soot and ash. She was unconscious, but they could still detect a faint heartbeat. Janet's mother, Mrs. Ochada, was at home when the phone rang. It was the school. The voice on the other end was hurried and frantic, explaining the details of the crash. Mrs. Ochada's heart stopped as she listened, unable to comprehend the words at first. She heard accident, fire, multiple injuries, and then the worst of all, fatalities. Where are my daughters, please? Where are my daughters? Mrs. Ochada pleaded, her voice breaking with fear. She could barely breathe as the terror sank in. The voice, on the other hand, tried to calm her down. We're doing everything we can. The children are being transported to the hospital. Please don't panic. Your daughters. Is Janelle alive? Mrs. Ochada interrupted, her voice desperate. Please, tell me Janelle is alive. The voice hesitated for a moment before responding. Yes, Janelle is alive. She's been taken to the hospital. Mrs. Ochada let out a sob of relief, but her heart was still heavy with dread. Her mind raced as she thought of her other daughters, Jessica and Christabel. What about them? She couldn't bring herself to ask the question she was most afraid of. At the hospital, chaos has already taken over. Doctors and nurses rushed from one room to another, trying to stabilize the many children who had been brought in after the crash. Some were unconscious, others barely clinging to life. But one thing was certain, the damage was severe. There had been too many injuries, too much destruction. Janet had been rushed into the emergency room, where doctors worked quickly to stabilize her. The shock and trauma of the crash had caused massive internal injuries, but against all odds, she was alive. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle. Her parents arrived at the hospital as quickly as they could, their hearts in their throats. Mrs. Ochada, still wearing her house slippers, rushed through the hallways looking for any sign of her daughter. When she finally saw Janelle lying in the hospital bed with an oxygen mask over her face, she couldn't hold back her tears. Janelle, my sweet girl, Mrs. Ochada whispered, her voice trembling as she touched her daughter's hand. Janelle didn't respond, but the faint pressure on her hand in her mother's was enough. She was still alive, but for how long? A doctor approached them, his expression sober. Mrs. Ochada, we're doing everything we can, but I need to tell you this. Your daughter was already gone when she arrived. We were able to revive her, but it was a miracle. She shouldn't have survived this. Mrs. Ochada's heart sank. She had known the worst was possible, but hearing the doctor's words made it real. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an answer to why this had happened. But all she could do was hold her daughter's hand, praying for her to pull through. As the hours passed, Mrs. Ochada stayed by Janelle's side, never leaving. Her heart was filled with regret. She blamed herself. If only I had prayed more, she thought. If only I had insisted they stay home, maybe they would still be here. The guilt ate at her, and every time she looked at Janelle, she lay motionless in the hospital bed. The pain grew deeper. She would never have imagined that Christmas, a time of joy, would become the darkest time of her life. Janet's recovery was slow. Every day she seemed to get a little stronger, but she remained in a haze, unaware of how much had changed. Her body was healing, but her mind was still trapped in a fog of confusion and grief. She had woken up once only to be surrounded by doctors and her parents, their faces filled with concern. Mom, Janet had whispered weakly, her voice hoarse. Where is Jessica and Christabel? The question hit Mrs. Ochada like a punch to the gut. She had hoped that Janet wouldn't remember right away, but somehow the shock of the crash might shield her from the painful truth. But Janet's eyes were wide, her face filled with fear, and Mrs. Ochada couldn't lie. They are gone, sweetie, she said softly, choking on the word. Jessica and Christabel, they didn't make it. They Janelle's eyes filled with tears and she turned away from her mother. It was as though the weight of the world had crashed down on her in an instant. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to accept it. She had lost her sisters, the ones who had been with her through everything, and now she was all alone. I didn't want them to go, Janelle whispered, her voice breaking. Mrs. Ochada knelt before her daughter's bed, brushing the hair from her face. I know, my darling, I know. But you are not alone. We are here. We are going to get through this together. Janelle's depression continued to deepen. The silence in their home was unbearable. Even when Janelle was well enough to return home, her parents struggled to help her. Janet would often retreat to her room, refusing to come out for days at a time. Her once bright spirit had dimmed, and her eyes were empty, devoid of the joy she had once carried. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, at the weight of the grief crushed her. Her parents had tried everything to reach her. They had taken her to therapy, hoping to help her process the trauma and loss. But Janet resisted, refusing to talk, and the pain she was feeling only grew stronger. Mrs. Ochada had even caught her daughter, slicing her arm with a broken piece of glass. Janet had passed out from the pain, and when her parents found her, they rushed her to the hospital once again. The doctors were horrified, but they were also understanding. Janet had been through so much. The loss of her sisters and tried to escape the pain is the only way she could hurt herself. Mr. Ochala was devastated. This was a different kind of grief, one that didn't just hurt the heart, but also the soul. The guilt and sorrow also remained, for not knowing what was happening to her daughter ate away at her. The weeks that followed were a mixture of quiet moments and long, painful hours. Janet's physical wound had healed, but the emotional scars were deep, and the journey back to herself was slow. Each day felt like a battle, one that she didn't know how to fight. The weight of the crash of losing her sisters still hung heavily on in her heart. She had moments when she wanted to scream, when she wanted to run away from the pain that seemed endless. But there was one thing that kept her tethered to the wall, and it was her mother's unwavering love. Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this. Janelle whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Ochada's heart broke for her daughter, but she smiled, her tears falling silently. There is nothing to fix, sweetie. We don't have to have all the answers. We're just going to keep going step by step. Janet's recovery wasn't instant. There were still moments of sadness, still moments when she withdrew, but there was a quiet strength growing inside her. She had learned to face the pain, to sit with it, and let it be part of her story. Later that week, the family made a decision. They were going to move to a new town, a new place, where they could start afresh. It wasn't that they wanted to forget what has happened. No, they would never forget, but they knew they needed to find a way to move forward, to begin again. The move wasn't an easy one. It was Christmas again, the first Christmas without Jessica and Christabel, but this time the family gathered around the table together. There was no loud celebration, no extravagant gifts, but there was peace. Mrs. Ochada knew that she had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild her family, to heal, to embrace the love that still remained. And though the scars of the past will never fade completely, the Ochadas family had found something new, hope, faith, and a future together. The journey was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long while, Mrs. Ochada felt a spark of joy. It wasn't the same as before, but it was enough. They would survive, they would heal. And in the end, that was all that mattered. We've come to the end of this story. I hope you did enjoy it. Please give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and don't forget to invite your friends and family